Welcome to the Untold Story podcast. I'm Martha MacCallum. Great to have you with us. We are now 7 weeks from Election Day, which is incredible. It feels like for so long we had a year, 2 years to go, and now we are so close to this enormous decision by the American people. So I'm very glad to be joined by Lee Carter, who all of you know from seeing her on Fox talking about polling and about people's sort of visceral reactions to the things that the candidates say. And I just want to give you a little bit of an intro here, Lee, because she is the president of Meslansky and Partners, a language strategist, a researcher, and the author of Persuasion, Convincing Others When Facts Don't Seem to Matter, which I think is really interesting, given the new polling that we're seeing and what we hear people talking about on the campaign trail. So Lee, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So give me a sense, if you would, Lee, of, what you're working on right now. And when you go into the field and you listen to people, how you frame your questions. We all have seen the dials, and we're so fascinated by watching people dial up or dial down during these big debates, and what you take away from that. But give me a little sense of what's on your mind right now as you look at the voting electorate and how they are taking all this in and responding to it.
So it's a really fascinating time because I feel like every week some major piece of news drops that changes everything all over again, and we have to relearn what's going on. And so what I'm constantly trying to do is understand why the voters are reacting the way they are. If I can't make sense of it, it's hard to make sense of the numbers. And so the most recent phenomenon we've had, obviously, is Kamala Harris is now the nominee, but she went from being the sort of least popular vice president in modern history to getting 89% voter enthusiasm among Democrats in a matter of days. And so I'm trying to really understand the why behind it. What's changed? And so we've seen the polling shift, and certainly that she's gained momentum. And it's not yet enough to say that she's going to win. It's not yet enough to have turned over the undecided voters, but it's certainly been enough to get Democrats excited. So the thing I'm trying to understand right now, is there anything she can do to win over the undecided voter? And when we were talking to voters after the debate, a lot of undecided voters still said, I still don't know what she's going to do different than Joe Biden. She talks about the opportunity economy. She talks about all these great ideas, and turning the page on herself or what is necessarily going to happen. And they haven't necessarily been given an answer to that question, and I haven't yet seen them turn. But my real question is there something she can say that is going to turn them over?
And what did you take away when you were watching the debate? And I know you've spoken about this on air, but I just want to drill down on it a little bit because I found it very interesting that the independent voters seem to be hugging the Trump line a little bit more closely. So they were liking what the independent voters were liking what Trump was saying during the debate, in a debate that a lot of people felt he did not perform well in. What did that tell you?
I was really surprised, frankly, because watching the debate, I didn't think that Donald Trump performed all that well. Talking to the voters, they still said that Kamala Harris won the night, but she didn't necessarily win their votes. And that shocked me because I thought what people needed to hear from Kamala Harris was that she satisfied them as a leader. And they said she sounded like a leader, but she was a rehearsed leader. And what I heard also is that many of them really like Donald Trump's policies. They really like the way things were under Donald Trump's economy, but they don't like Donald Trump, the person. So they're almost looking for a reason or something to say, I need to be able to walk away from Donald Trump, but I can't. And they won't. And so when he talks about the economy, when he talks about his policies, they're lock and step along with him. And many independent voters right now, many more, I think, even than Democrat voters, are lock and step with Republicans, but they don't want to identify as Republicans because they're troubled by what the party is. And so that's where we are right now. And I think it's fascinating to watch.
It sure is. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the fact that she is, in a very calculating way, trying to give them what they're looking for. And I think about the fact that she said the other night in the debate that she's a gun owner, which I've never heard her say before. I don't know how long she's been a gun owner. It's not something she's ever really aligned with in terms of the gun owning population. And she says she's not going to take your gun away, despite the fact that she said just a few years back when she ran in 2019 that she was in favor of mandatory gun buybacks. So I wonder how that's going for her, that this transition of sort of being a little unexpected in terms of where she comes down on things. I wonder if it is convincing voters and those independents that you speak of who will decide this election. They have to be convinced that this is authentic, that she got to all of this from a real place.
That's the thing that I heard voters say that they question. They question her authenticity. They question her flip-flops. In fact, one person in one of the focus groups I had even suggested that I bet the receipt that she got that gun with is still fresh because they probably bought it during debate prep, making sure that she had an answer to this question that was going to satisfy the middle. Bernie Sanders talked about how she would, he still believed that she was a progressive, but she would do what it took to win the election. And that stuck with a lot of people. So there's a lot of questions about who Kamala Harris is. And when I'm talking to undecided voters, the questions really are, who is she really? I'm not sure. And failing her telling us, many people say that they think that this is going to be a continuation of Joe Biden's policies, or something worse. Many people fill in the blanks by saying that it's something farther to the left. People aren't necessarily buying her answers on fracking and her flip-flops on that and other things either. I think it's a really interesting question. Some people called her a chameleon during the group, but it's on the other hand, there are other people who are extremely satisfied with how well she's done, and she's checked every box for them. I think Democrats are feeling really, really good about the possibilities right now. But I do think these sort of independent, undecided voters have a lot of questions that aren't answered yet.
What do you sense? I think back to 2020, and I think about the fact that Biden won the election despite the fact that he almost never left his basement. Now, that was an extraordinary period. It was a pandemic, but he was, he was not wanting to be nailed down on any kind of new ground in terms of policy. He did very little campaigning. So I look at this matchup, and now everybody's out there. They're traveling all the time. They're going to big rallies. She is an energetic campaigner. She's very articulate. She is, younger, which a lot of people said they wanted someone younger. So now she appears to be leading the Pennsylvania polling that we just got. And I'm wondering if that tells you that this tide is turning her way or not.
So right now, I'm really trying to understand if the polling that we got in Pennsylvania is an outlier or an early indicator. And I'm just not sure yet. I haven't seen other polls that suggest the same thing. I haven't seen huge shifts. She's more or less gained a half a point here, a quarter of a point here, but we haven't seen these full kinds of swings that we're seeing today. And so I'm just not sure that there's certain things that I question about this poll. I see some huge shifts in demographics that, we talked earlier about the shifts in the Hispanic vote. Is that really what's going on there? You see women 17 points ahead with Kamala Harris, men 12 points ahead. Is that exactly what's going on? That's a trend that we're seeing across the board. But as I'm looking at this poll, I'm really trying to understand why is it so different than all the others. But we haven't seen a ton of polls come out on the state level since the debate. This is one of the early ones. So I'm unclear. But others that I have seen haven't suggested that she's winning by as much, and she certainly hasn't won over as many undecided voters as we're seeing in that poll. So I think that's one to watch.
We also talked on the show a little while ago about the fact that she's ahead 17 points with women voters, and he's ahead 13 points with male voters. And I said to you, but there are more women voters than male voters. I don't know by how many, but I know it's a pretty significant margin. Could that make the difference in this election?
It could make the difference in this election. I think a lot of people are talking about the power right now of Taylor Swift's endorsement, and because it's really mobilizing more women. And in certain key counties, if you look at those two counties in Pennsylvania, a lot of people are talking about them right now, Northampton and Erie. Those both have more women than men. And so that can make a big difference. But there are many people out there who say the story this year is actually going to be about the young men coming out to vote, because a lot of young men aren't calculated as likely voters. There might be first-time voters, but we're seeing young men in large numbers are coming out much more for Donald Trump than they are for Kamala Harris. And if they engage with the enthusiasm that they seem to be engaging in TikTok and other places right now, the story really could be about the young white male, which is something we haven't talked about in an election for a while. It's always been the soccer moms, the hockey moms, or these moms. So I'm interested to see what happens there.
That's really interesting. What is on your mind in terms of, you talk about language and persuasion. Who do you think, you just mentioned Taylor Swift, what is persuading voters these days? And who are they allowing to persuade them? Because we know that they have a diminished trust in the media. We know that social media plays a big role in all of this. What's your sense of who is able to persuade voters?
It's a really good question. I think it's very hard to persuade voters right now. And that's why we sort of have this locked in 48% vote where we're stuck and you don't see a lot of movement despite the fact that you see a great debate performance or not. People are stuck in their ways. So it's really hard to move them. It happens on the edges. And I think it's not just that we're listening to the candidates for what they say themselves, we're listening to what our friends say. And so the shift in Kamala Harris has been pretty pronounced. She's shifted the conversation about this great threat to democracy that only Joe Biden can win to this is a fight for freedom. And when we fight together, we win. It's a very different tone. And so it's now engaging people in conversation. So people are having conversations with their friends about freedom, about getting engaged, about getting involved. It doesn't feel so victim-y. It doesn't feel so scary. And so she's given them messaging that actually is repeatable and given people hope. And people that didn't have hope. Because when you look at voter enthusiasm, when Joe Biden was the candidate, it was in the 30s. Now it's in the high 80s. And she's totally changed the conversation, and she's changed the conversation among voters. And that's really, really important. The tools that we give people to have conversations with each other matter a lot. In 2016, Donald Trump changed the game because when you talk to voters, you said to them, it wasn't just that people heard Donald Trump's message, it's they were telling it to each other. Why are you going to vote for Donald Trump? Well, he's going to make America great again. Well, how's he going to do that? Well, he's going to build a wall. He's going to get tough on China. He's bringing back jobs. He had such a simple, repeatable message that people were talking about it. And that's really what it takes, I think, to change the conversation and change the narrative.
The Untold Story continues right after this.
So in terms of her economic message, because that continues to be the most important factor for voters, even though, she talks a lot about freedom. And I think that's, the subtext of that is abortion rights, essentially. Her economic message, to build more opportunity for people is really based in helping people, sort of giving people money, whether it's in the form of tax breaks or, student loan relief, which she hasn't talked about as much. She's talking a lot about helping home builders get tax breaks and helping first-time homeowners and people who are having kids get tax breaks. Does that translate for people, do you think? Do they see that as, well, that will help me pay my bills and that will make my life better?
What I heard from voters when she laid out, one of the first questions in the debate was about that. She gave a laundry list of, I'm going to give $50,000 to businesses. I'm giving first-time home buyers this amount of money. A lot of people heard that's a lot of money that she's giving out, and I'm probably not going to get it for myself. I want to know what she's going to do to bring the cost of living down. Things don't feel good. And so she didn't answer the question that was on everybody's mind, which is, how are you going to deal with inflation? How are you going to what are you going to do for my earning power? How are you going to make me feel better about the economy, not by big handouts, but rather by getting the whole economy back in order? And she didn't satisfy them with that answer. She didn't satisfy with her interview on ABC that she did as a follow-up when she answered the question by saying, I'm middle class and talked about lawns. I think people were left saying, what is happening here? And this is one of the biggest problems she has. She doesn't have an answer on the economy, the number one issue on voters' minds. And even though Donald Trump didn't win that debate from a technical perspective for that night, he did win this framing exercise, because when we talk about the economy, what most people will say, and we talk about Kamala Harris, they say, well, then why hasn't she done it in the last 3.5 years? And that's one of the last lines he used in his debate closing argument, but it's one that sticks with people. If she's going to give us an opportunity, if she's giving us a leg up, why hasn't she done it while she's in office? And I think that that was a really, really smart move by Donald Trump in the debate.
the discussion of him being a threat to democracy. Do you find that resonating, the language of that? Does that work against him?
I think the threat to democracy language actually does the absolute opposite of what Democrats are hoping to do. One, it's dangerous, and we've seen that play out over the last couple of months with the 2 assassination attempts against Donald Trump's life. 2, it actually rallies Republicans together because they don't believe it to be true. And they're saying, how could you say that we're supporting somebody who's a threat to democracy? So it almost makes them support Donald Trump no matter what, because it's like you're accusing us of not caring about the thing that matters the most. It seems extreme, and it doesn't really translate. If you don't like Donald Trump, you already believe that. If you're on the fence, it doesn't move you. The smartest thing that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have done is actually made the talk about Donald Trump be much smaller. Kamala Harris said something. She said, he's a small man who has big consequences. And that actually played very well and made people think about things. When Tim Walz started talking about Donald Trump and J.D. Vance as weird, that took hold and made people start questioning things that they didn't otherwise question. But the threat to democracy is almost too big. It's too scary. It puts people in this sort of crippling fear feeling, and it backfires.
So give me a sense. I want to step back a little bit about you and the work that you do. And how did you, how were you drawn to this kind of work? And how do you carry out your research? What is your next step in terms of going into the field and talking to people?
So I've always been fascinated with why people think what they think or believe what they believe or feel what they feel. And I've always been fascinated also by the impact of language on people. So like in high school, I would have conversations at my dinner table with my parents about things like, so what's the difference between a nerd, a geek, a dork, and a dweeb? In the dictionary, they're the same exact thing, but in your mind's eye, it's something totally, totally different. So I've always been fascinated by the impact of messaging on people. And it's been a particular interest to me as it applies to politics, because that's been a passion of mine too. I grew up in a family who was very, very political. My great-grandfather was a congressman, and it was just part of our conversation. And I had a split family, some Republicans, some Democrats. So I kind of got used to this like back and forth.
I had that too. Yeah.
I love it.
It's great. No, it makes you a good debater, and it helps you understand both sides for sure.
Absolutely. And so I've just always been curious. And so when I found out that this could be a profession where you could actually spend time trying to understand how messaging moves people, and the impact of messaging on an election, on how businesses are run, on how we make decisions, I was sold. And so I've been doing this now for a long time. I probably shouldn't say how long, because it would give away my age, but it's been a long time. But the initial engagement that I had in it was really in the 2000 and 2004 election with George W. Bush, and the impact on messaging. It was so many people said that he wasn't necessarily the more qualified one, but he was the one that connected. And you could just feel it. You could just see it. And I've always been a big believer in that. And I've been doing this work ever since. And I think what was fascinating in 2015, when we were watching the primaries, I was doing this research and I used to test whatever topic I was talking about. So in this case, I was talking about electric vehicles in San Francisco. And I used to test messages, political messages, just to make sure that the dials were working. So I'm testing something different, but I just want to make sure that everything's working. And so I tested Donald Trump with a group of environmentally engaged people who are likely to buy an electric vehicle in 2015. So you're talking about a pretty lefty audience. And I played some of the messages about Donald Trump. And I asked people what they thought, and they said, he's a buffoon, this is crazy, is it a joke? And then I asked them to write down on their paper the 3 things that they thought about Donald Trump after hearing his message. When I gathered the papers at the end of the group, people said things like, provocative, that's a leader, he's going to blow things up, it's something different than I've heard before. And I was like, this is really interesting, because people aren't saying out loud what they're thinking in their head. And so that's when I started to retool how I was testing things, because I realized that people weren't saying it out loud. And so I started to do much more of my testing online than I do it in-person focus groups, which also helps as well with COVID. But that was sort of a big shift there, and realizing that people won't say it out loud among their peers.
So what do you think was effective about Joe Biden in 2020?
Well, I think what was effective about him is he did no harm in a moment when people wanted change. I think things felt a little out of control. We had COVID. We had a lot of fear. And I think Donald Trump had a couple of missteps right before he ran out of office after he had COVID himself. And I think the country was left hoping for some stability. A lot of people gravitated towards his message of decency. And I was like, that's a bar. We're just going for decent. But what's ended up happening since is things feel worse, and there's not a burning pandemic, and there's not all these other things. And so this isn't a change election from Trump, and that's what Kamala Harris is running on. This is a change election from Joe Biden, and that's what Kamala Harris needs to convince people of, that she's going to be something different than Joe Biden is, because people feel worse now, today, than they did 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, we were in the middle of a pandemic, and people hadn't all gotten shots in arms yet. Like, we were still in shutdown. And when you think about that, people are in a really, really down place right now. They do want change. And so this is also going to be a change election. And I think it's going to be harder to be someone who doesn't represent something different than they've heard before. And that's Kamala Harris's position right now. She's got to convince us that she's not the same. So she can't just go underground.
So what do you sense that people want now? If, they wanted stability, decency in 2020, and you just raised good questions about whether or not they got it. But what is your sense of what they want now? And are they finding it in either of these candidates?
I'd love to say that it was simple as cost of goods, but I don't think it is. I think right before Joe Biden exited the race, the biggest issue on voters' minds were that things felt unfair. They felt like prices were unfair. They felt like they were treated unfairly. They felt like they were judged, that they were looked down upon, that they were promised things that never were delivered on. And so Donald Trump could deliver on all these things because he was going to fight for them. He was going to fight back. He was going to fight this fairness thing because things had been unfair to him too. And he was really winning on that narrative about fairness. He's lost that narrative since Kamala Harris came in. He's really on his heels. He's defending himself all the time. He's reacting to crowd-size comments. He's really reactive. And he's not pulling the mantle up of that idea that I'm going to fight back. And we know that a majority of Americans want someone who's going to fight the system right now because they feel like it's broken. It's not working for them. And they want somebody who's going to fight back and change things. Donald Trump can be that person, but he's got to get back to being front-footed and the fighter, not the one that's reacting to everything that's put down in front of him. And I think ultimately that's what it's going to come down to, is the person that Americans feel like is going to fight for them.
So interesting to talk to you, Lee. Thank you very much. We have 7 weeks to go. When is your next dial opportunity, do you think? Do you know?
I don't know exactly, but I'm pretty sure we're going to be doing it on October 1st for the VP debate. I'm hoping to do it sooner, though.
For the VP debate. That would be so interesting. I'm really looking forward to watching Governor Tim Walz and Senator J.D. Vance go at it. Should be quite a night. Lee,
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Great to talk to you. Lee Carter, president of Mizlansky and Partners, a language strategy firm. It's not what you say, it's what they hear is their main motto and thrust of their work. So great to talk to you. Thank you so much, Lee. We'll see you soon.
I look forward to it.
That's the Untold Story for this week, or for this Wednesday, I should say. I'm Martha McCallum. It's always great to have you with us. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Make sure to rate and review. For more podcasts, go to foxnewspodcast.com. Listen ad-free with the Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.